I was crouched in my garage, organizing my emergency preparedness supplies, when I heard the sharp click of heels on my driveway, followed by an imperious knock that could only mean trouble. My name is Benjamin Burke, and I had just moved to Oregon 3 months ago after accepting a job at a tech company in Portland. I bought a house in a quiet suburb called Cedar Mills, a nice little ranch-style place that sat on the edge of a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. The important detail that would become the center of my life for the next few weeks was this: my house was not part of Willow Creek Estates. My property line ended exactly where their HOA jurisdiction began. I had made absolutely certain of this before buying because I had heard enough horror stories about HOAs to last a lifetime. I stood up from where I had been arranging water purification tablets and emergency rations, wiping dust off my jeans as I walked to the garage door. Standing there with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield was a woman in her late 40s with an aggressively styled blonde bob and a pantsuit that screamed middle management. Her lips were pursed so tightly they had nearly disappeared. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I certainly hope so," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of forced politeness that was actually rudeness in disguise. "I'm Patricia Caldwell, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your garage situation immediately." I blinked. My garage situation. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she glanced past me at the neatly organized shelves I had spent the entire morning installing. "Yes, several residents have reported seeing you stockpiling supplies. According to our community standards, all emergency preparedness materials must be registered with the HOA and made available for community use in the event of a disaster." For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process what I had just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's quite simple," Patricia said, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "Section 12. Paragraph 4 of our HOA covenant states that all resources that could be used in an emergency must be inventoried and shared among residents to ensure fairness and equity in crisis situations. I'll need you to fill out these forms detailing everything you have stored here." I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest, but I suppressed it. "Madam, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't live in Willow Creek Estates. My house isn't part of your HOA." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Your property is adjacent to our community, which means you benefit from our maintained standards and property values. It's only fair that you contribute to and follow our guidelines." "That's not how property law works," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "My house is not part of your HOA. I didn't sign any covenant. I have no obligation to register anything with you, and I certainly don't have to share my personal property with anyone." "We'll see about that," Patricia said, her voice turning cold. "I'll be filing a formal complaint. You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Burke." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, leaving me standing there wondering what I had just gotten myself into. Over the next few days, I tried to put the bizarre encounter out of my mind. I continued with my routine, going to work, coming home, and slowly settling into my new house. I had always been someone who believed in being prepared. Growing up in California, I had lived through enough earthquakes and wildfire scares to know that having emergency supplies wasn't paranoia. It was common sense. My garage now contained enough food, water, medical supplies, and equipment to keep me comfortable for at least 3 months if something went wrong. On Thursday evening, I found a letter taped to my front door. It was printed on official-looking letterhead that read Willow Creek Estates, HOA, at the top in bold letters. I pulled it down and read it standing right there on my porch. "Dear Mr. Burke, This letter serves as formal notice that you are in violation of Willow Creek Estates HOA Covenant Section 12, Paragraph 4, regarding emergency resource management. You have been assessed a fine of $500, payable within 30 days. Additionally, you must submit a complete inventory of all emergency supplies, including but not limited to food stores, water, medical equipment, tools, generators, fuel, and any other materials that could be utilized in a disaster scenario. Failure to comply will result in additional fines of $200 per day until compliance is achieved. Furthermore, you are required to make these supplies available for community distribution in the event of an emergency, as determined by the HOA board. Sincerely, Patricia Caldwell, HOA President. I read the letter 3 times, my disbelief growing with each pass. Then I pulled out my phone and took several photos of it before walking inside. I had kept all my closing documents in a file cabinet in my home office, and I pulled them out now, spreading them across my desk. I found my property survey, my title insurance, and my deed. I traced the property lines with my finger, confirming what I already knew. My lot was designated as Lot 47B on the survey map. Willow Creek Estates consisted of lots 1 through 45. There was a clear notation on the survey that read, Lots 46A, 46B, 47A, and 47B are not part of Willow Creek Estates HOA and are not subject to any covenants or restrictions associated with said HOA. I had literally paid extra for a survey before closing specifically to ensure this. My real estate agent had even joked about how thorough I was being. The next morning, I drafted a response letter. I kept it professional but firm. Dear Miss Caldwell, I am writing in response to your letter dated November 14th. I must inform you that I am not a member of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, nor is my property subject to any of its covenants or restrictions. My property, designated as Lot 47B, is explicitly excluded from the HOA as documented in the property survey and deed, both of which I have attached copies of for your reference. Therefore, I am not in violation of any HOA rules, I owe no fines, and I have no obligation to inventory or share any of my personal property. I request that the HOA cease all communications regarding this matter. Any further harassment will be considered a legal matter. Sincerely, Benjamin Burke. I printed 2 copies, mailed 1 certified mail, and kept 1 for my records. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Saturday morning I woke up to someone pounding on my front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I pulled on a shirt and stumbled to the door, yanking it open to find Patricia standing there with 2 other people. One was a man in his 50s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a HOA board member button pinned to his chest. The other was a younger woman, maybe in her 30s, holding a tablet and looking uncomfortable. Mr. Burke, Patricia said, not waiting for me to speak. Since you refuse to cooperate voluntarily, the HOA board has authorized an inspection of your property. Please step aside. Absolutely not, I said, blocking the doorway with my body. You have no authority to inspect anything. Get off my property. We have every right to ensure community safety, Patricia insisted. If you're hoarding supplies that could help people in an emergency, we need to know about it. I'm not hoarding anything, I said, my voice rising. I'm storing my own supplies on my own property that has nothing to do with your HOA. You need to leave now, or I'm calling the police. The man in the polo shirt stepped forward. Now let's everyone just calm down. I'm Richard Hendricks, HOA Vice President. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. The thing is, Mr. Burke, we've had some concerns raised by residents about the amount of supplies you've been bringing in. In this community, we believe in sharing and helping each other out." "That's great," I said, "but I don't live in your community. My house is not part of your HOA. I've already sent a letter explaining this with documentation." "We received your letter," Patricia said dismissively. "But we've consulted with our attorney, and he believes that since your property directly benefits from our maintained standards, you have an implicit obligation to contribute to community welfare." "Your attorney is wrong," I said flatly. "And if you don't leave my property right now, I'm calling the police for trespassing." Patricia's face flushed red. "Fine, but this isn't over. We'll be taking further action." They left, and I immediately called the non-emergency police line. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who took down my information, and said an officer would come by to take a report. Officer Martinez showed up about an hour later, a stocky man in his 30s who listened patiently as I explained everything and showed him the letters, my property documents, and photos I had taken of Patricia and the others on my doorstep. "So you're definitely not part of this HOA?" he asked, reviewing my survey map. "Definitely not. I specifically bought a house that wasn't. And they're trying to force you to give them access to your emergency supplies. Apparently they think they have the right to inventory and redistribute my personal property in an emergency." Officer Martinez shook his head. "I've dealt with some aggressive HOAs, but this is a new one. Look, I can't do much right now since they left when you asked them to, but I'm going to file this report. If they come back and you ask them to leave and they refuse, call 911. That's trespassing, and we can arrest them for it. Also, you might want to consider talking to a lawyer about a cease and desist letter or a restraining order if this continues." "I was hoping it wouldn't come to that," I said. "Hope for the best, plan for the worst, right?" He gestured at my garage. "Looks like you've got that philosophy down." After Officer Martinez left, I spent the rest of Saturday installing a security camera system. I mounted cameras covering my driveway, front door, back door, and garage. They fed to an app on my phone with cloud backup. If the HOA tried anything else, I would have video evidence. Sunday was quiet, which should have been my first warning. Monday morning, I left for work at 7:30 like usual. I worked as a software engineer, and my commute into Portland took about 40 minutes depending on traffic. That day, I got stuck behind an accident on Highway 26 and didn't get home until nearly 7 in the evening. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. My garage door was open about a foot, and I knew I had closed it that morning. I parked and approached cautiously, pulling up the security camera app on my phone as I walked. The footage showed Patricia and 3 other people I didn't recognize arriving at 10 in the morning. They had tried my garage door, found it locked, and then one of them had produced what looked like a crowbar. They had forced the door open and gone inside. The cameras showed them spending nearly 30 minutes in my garage, and when they left, they were carrying boxes, my supplies. I felt rage boil up inside me as I yanked the garage door fully open and surveyed the damage. They had taken at least a dozen cases of bottled water, several boxes of non-perishable food, my first aid kit, and my backup generator. Hundreds of dollars worth of supplies, just gone. I called 911 immediately. 2 police cars arrived within 15 minutes. I showed the responding officers, Martinez again and a new officer named Thompson, the security footage on my phone. We watched the 4 people breaking into my garage and taking my property. "That's pretty clear-cut burglary," Officer Thompson said. "Do you know who these people are?" "That's Patricia Caldwell, the HOA president I told you about," I said, pointing at the screen. I don't know the others. And you definitely didn't give them permission to enter or take anything. Absolutely not. I told them to stay off my property. I have that documented in the report from Saturday. The officers took detailed statements and photographs of the damage to my garage door. They took copies of the security footage. Officer Martinez looked grim. Mr. Burke, I'm going to be straight with you. This is burglary, possibly organized crime, depending on how deep this goes. We're going to need to bring in detectives. This HOA has essentially committed a home invasion and theft. That's serious. I want to press charges, I said firmly. All of them. I want them arrested. We'll do what we can, Officer Thompson said. In the meantime, I'd recommend getting a lawyer. This might get messy. The officers left, and I spent the evening securing my garage door as best as I could and making a detailed inventory of everything that had been stolen. The total value came to over $3,000. I also downloaded all my security footage to multiple backup drives. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and went to meet with a lawyer. I had found a firm that specialized in property law and made an emergency appointment. The attorney I met with was a sharp woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, who listened to my entire story without interrupting, reviewed all my documents, and watched the security footage. "This is outrageous," she said when I finished. "And fortunately for you, you have an airtight case. They have no legal standing whatsoever. Your property is clearly not part of their HOA, and even if it were, no HOA covenant could legally require you to surrender personal property or allow forced inspections without a warrant. What they did was commit multiple crimes." "So what do we do?" I asked. "First, I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter that will make it very clear that any further contact or action by this HOA will result in a lawsuit. Second, I'm going to file a civil suit against Patricia Caldwell personally and the HOA as an organization for trespassing, theft, property damage, and harassment. We're going to ask for recovery of all stolen property, compensation for damages, and punitive damages because this behavior is so egregious. Third, I'm going to contact the police and make sure they're taking this seriously as a criminal matter. How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, though at this point I didn't really care. I was too angry. "My retainer is $5,000, but honestly, I think we can get the HOA's insurance to cover everything plus your legal fees. This is such a clear-cut case of wrongdoing that they're going to want to settle rather than go to trial." I wrote the check. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Detective Sarah Williams from the Washington County Sheriff's Office contacted me and came to my house to conduct a thorough investigation. She was a serious woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely angry on my behalf as she reviewed everything. "I've seen some HOA overreach in my time," she said, "but this crosses way over the line into criminal activity. We're going to execute a search warrant on Miss Caldwell's home and the homes of the other individuals in that video. If your property is there, we'll recover it." "What kind of charges are we looking at?" I asked. "Burglary in the first degree, theft in the first degree, criminal mischief. Possibly criminal conspiracy if we can prove they planned this together. Oregon doesn't mess around with property crimes." First-degree burglary alone carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years. 2 days later, I got a call from Detective Williams. "We executed the warrants this morning. We found most of your property stored in Patricia Caldwell's garage." She claimed she was holding it for community use, but that doesn't change the fact that it was stolen. "We've made arrests." "All of them?" I asked. "Patricia Caldwell, Richard Hendricks, and 2 other HOA board members named Denise Watts and Frank Morrison." They're all being charged with burglary, theft, and conspiracy. The DA is taking this very seriously." I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me, followed quickly by exhaustion. I just wanted this to be over. My lawyer Margaret called that same afternoon. "I've been contacted by the HOA's insurance company. They want to settle. I think we can get you everything you're asking for and more. Are you interested in discussing settlement terms?" "What are they offering?" I asked. "Full return of all stolen property. Compensation for all damages including the garage door, your legal fees, a public apology, and $50,000 in punitive damages. They also want an agreement that you won't sue the individual homeowners of the HOA, just the organization itself and the board members involved." "I was never planning to sue random homeowners," I said. "They didn't do anything wrong. It was just the board." "Then we have a deal. I'll draw up the paperwork." But it wasn't quite over yet. 2 days after the arrests, I came home from work to find a group of about 15 people standing in my driveway. For a moment I tensed, thinking it was another HOA confrontation, but then I recognized that several of them were holding signs that said things like "Thank you" and "We're sorry." I parked and got out cautiously. A woman in her 30s stepped forward, looking nervous. "Mr. Burke." "My name is Rachel Graves. I live in Willow Creek Estates. We heard about what happened and we wanted to apologize. Most of us had no idea what Patricia and the board were doing. When we found out they broke into your house and stole from you, we were horrified. We called an emergency HOA meeting," an older man added. "We voted to remove the entire board and dissolve several of the more ridiculous rules they'd been enforcing. Nobody in this neighborhood actually believed in that stuff about communal emergency supplies. Patricia just made it up." "She made it up," I repeated. "Completely," Rachel said. "We went through all the HOA documents. That section she kept citing doesn't exist. She fabricated it. She'd been adding rules on her own without board approval for months. Turns out she was basically running the HOA like her personal fiefdom." I didn't know what to say. I'd been so focused on fighting the board that I hadn't really thought about the regular residents who were just living their lives. "We're trying to reform the HOA," another woman said. "Make it actually useful instead of tyrannical. And we wanted you to know that even though you're not part of our community officially, you're our neighbor, and we're here if you need anything." "That means a lot," I said honestly. "Thank you." They left after a few more minutes of apologizing and welcoming me to the neighborhood. I went inside feeling like maybe this situation was finally reaching a conclusion. The criminal case moved forward steadily. Patricia Caldwell tried to fight the charges initially, maintaining that she had the authority to access my property and take supplies for community welfare. Her lawyer apparently advised her that this defense was nonsense because she eventually agreed to a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to burglary in the 2nd degree and theft in the 1st degree. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison with the possibility of early release for good behavior, 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay restitution. Richard Hendricks and Denise Watts took similar deals. Frank Morrison fought his charges, insisting he had just been following Patricia's orders and didn't know they were doing anything illegal. But the video footage clearly showed him helping to pry open my garage door. He was convicted at trial and got a harsher sentence than the others, 2 years in prison. My stolen property was returned, though some of the food had been opened and used. The insurance settlement came through, and I received a check for $50,000 plus full coverage of my legal fees and property damages. Margaret Chen had done an excellent job, but the most interesting development came about 6 weeks after the initial break-in. Detective Williams called me and asked if I could come down to the station to answer some follow-up questions. When I arrived, she led me to an interview room where a man in a suit was waiting. "Mr. Burke, this is Agent David Reeves from the FBI," Detective Williams said. I sat down slowly, confused. "The FBI, why?" Agent Reeves opened a folder. "During the investigation into Patricia Caldwell's activities, we discovered something interesting. It turns out she'd been running a similar scheme in multiple locations over the past decade." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Patricia Caldwell isn't her real name. She's actually Patricia Ann Caldwell Morrison, and she has a history of inserting herself into HOA leadership positions and then using that authority to commit fraud, theft, and extortion. She did this in Arizona 5 years ago and in Nevada 3 years ago. She would move to a new area, buy a house in an HOA community, quickly get herself elected to the board through a combination of volunteering and intimidation, and then start enforcing fake rules to extract money and resources from residents." "You're saying she's a con artist?" I asked, stunned. "A very good one," Agent Reeves said. "In Arizona, she convinced homeowners they needed to pay special assessments for security upgrades that never happened. She pocketed over $200,000 before someone caught on. She fled before she could be arrested. In Nevada, she ran a similar scheme involving mandatory landscaping contracts with companies she had financial interests in. Another $150,000. She skipped town again. So coming after my emergency supplies was just her latest scam." "Actually, we think it was going to be the foundation for a bigger one," Detective Williams said. "We found documents in her home outlining a plan to establish a mandatory community emergency preparedness program where all residents would have to pay monthly fees for access to communal supplies that she would purchase and control. She was using your supplies as seed inventory. And she would have skimmed money off the top," Agent Reeves added. "Classic fraud scheme. The good news is that by catching her here, we can now connect her to the previous crimes. She's looking at federal charges for wire fraud and interstate flight to avoid prosecution on top of the state charges she's already facing." "What does this mean for her sentence?" I asked. "She's going to prison for a long time," Agent Reeves said. "We're talking 10 to 15 years minimum with the federal charges added on. She won't be running any more HOA scams." I left the police station feeling like I had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple property dispute. Over the next few weeks, the story made regional news. Reporters called asking for interviews, which I mostly declined. I didn't want to become the face of HOA horror stories, even though mine had a relatively happy ending. The settlement money went into my savings account. I used some of it to upgrade my security system even further and to replace all the supplies that had been stolen with better quality versions. I also donated $5,000 to a local charity that helped victims of property crimes, which felt like the right thing to do. The new Willow Creek Estates HOA board reached out to me through Rachel Graves and invited me to their meetings as a guest if I ever wanted to attend. I politely declined but said I appreciated the offer. They seemed to be running things much more reasonably now. The ridiculous rules Patricia had invented were struck down, and they focused on actual community issues like organizing neighborhood watches and maintaining common areas. Life slowly returned to normal. I went to work, came home, and enjoyed my house. My neighbors in Willow Creek Estates were friendly when I saw them, and nobody ever mentioned emergency supplies or HOA rules again. About 3 months after everything started, I was working in my garage on a Saturday afternoon when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned to find an elderly man standing at the end of my driveway, leaning on a cane. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying not to sound defensive. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," he said. "My name is Walter Briggs. I live 3 streets over in Willow Creek. I heard about what happened with Patricia and the board, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For standing up to them," Walter said. "I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years. Patricia moved in about 2 years ago and everything changed. She got herself elected HOA president within 6 months and immediately started making life miserable for everyone. I got fined 3 times for having my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours on collection day. My neighbor got fined for having the wrong shade of white on her fence. It was insane." "That sounds awful," I said. It was. But nobody wanted to fight her because she was so aggressive and vindictive. She would make your life hell if you challenged her. When you refused to back down, even though you weren't even in the HOA, it inspired other people to start questioning her authority. That's what led to the emergency meeting and eventually to people looking into whether she was actually following proper procedures. "I didn't really do anything special," I said. "I just didn't want someone stealing my stuff." Walter laughed. "Sometimes standing up for yourself is enough to start a change. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you and welcome you to the neighborhood properly, even if you're not technically part of our HOA." We talked for a few more minutes, and Walter invited me to a neighborhood barbecue the following weekend. I said I would think about it, though I probably wouldn't go. I liked my privacy, and I'd had enough community involvement to last me a while. The criminal proceedings dragged on for months. Patricia's federal trial was scheduled for the following summer, but based on the evidence, her conviction seemed inevitable. The other board members all completed their plea agreements and served their time. Richard Hendricks got out after 9 months and immediately moved out of state. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that his wife had divorced him over the whole incident. My lawyer, Margaret, sent me regular updates on the case law implications of my situation. Apparently, my case was being cited in legal journals as an example of HOA overreach and the importance of clearly defined property boundaries. Several law schools were using the security footage in their property law classes as a teaching tool about trespassing and burglary. I found that both amusing and slightly disturbing. I never wanted to be famous, and I certainly never wanted to be famous for having my garage broken into. Work continued as normal. My colleagues knew vaguely that I'd had some trouble with neighbors, but not the full details. I preferred it that way. I was just Benjamin Burke, software engineer, not Benjamin Burke, the guy who took down a criminal HOA president. One evening in early spring, about 7 months after the initial confrontation, I was cooking dinner when my doorbell rang. I had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors, so I checked the security camera feed on my phone first. Standing on my porch was a professionally dressed woman in her 30s holding a briefcase. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you, Mr. Burke? My name is Jennifer Martinez. I'm a reporter with the Oregonian. I'm doing a series on HOA reform and accountability, and I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about your experience. I've already told several reporters I'm not interested in interviews," I said. "I understand, and I respect that. But this isn't just about your story. There's a movement building in the state legislature to pass new laws regulating HOAs and providing better protection for homeowners. Your case has become a focal point for that movement. I thought you might want to know about it." That got my attention. "What kind of laws?" "Better oversight of HOA boards, stricter rules about what kinds of covenants can be enforced, mandatory transparency in HOA finances, and clearer penalties for board members who abuse their authority." Several legislators have cited your case specifically when discussing why these reforms are needed. I considered this. If I talk to you, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to be a crusader. I just wanted to be left alone. That's exactly what makes your story powerful, Jennifer said. You're not some activist with an agenda. You're just a regular person who wanted to live in peace and got targeted by an abusive system. I invited her in, and we talked for over an hour. She asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in the broader implications rather than just the dramatic details. When she left, I felt like maybe some good could come from the whole mess after all. Her article ran 2 weeks later as a front-page feature. It was balanced and well-written, focusing on the need for HOA reform while telling my story as an illustrative example. The article included comments from other homeowners who had experienced HOA overreach, quotes from the legislators working on reform bills, and expert analysis from property law attorneys, including Margaret Chen. The response was overwhelming. I started receiving emails and letters from people all over the state, and even from other states, sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking me for speaking out. It was humbling and a little overwhelming. I tried to respond to as many as I could, offering advice to seek legal counsel and document everything. The Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2847, the Homeowner Protection and HOA Accountability Act, in June. The bill included provisions requiring annual audits of HOA finances, establishing a state oversight board for investigating complaints against HOAs, limiting the types of fines and penalties HOAs could impose, and creating explicit protections for homeowners who weren't actually part of an HOA but lived adjacent to one. The governor cited my case during the signing ceremony, which I watched on television from my living room. It felt surreal to hear my name mentioned in the state capitol. Patricia Caldwell's federal trial concluded in August. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The judge noted in her sentencing remarks that Patricia had shown a pattern of predatory behavior targeting homeowners and communities, and that a substantial sentence was necessary to protect the public and deter others from similar conduct. I didn't attend the trial, but Detective Williams called to let me know the outcome. "Justice was served," she said. "She won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Life finally, truly settled down after that. The media attention faded, the legal proceedings were complete, and I could just be a person living in my house again. I expanded my emergency preparedness supplies, not because I was paranoid, but because I genuinely believed it was smart to be ready for anything. Oregon sat on a major earthquake fault line, and having supplies could literally save your life if the big one hit. I also started attending the neighborhood barbecues that Walter kept inviting me to. The people in Willow Creek Estates were actually pretty nice once they weren't being controlled by a con artist pretending to be an HOA president. I made friends with several of my neighbors, including Rachel Graves and her husband Tom, who had 2 kids who loved to ride their bikes up and down the street. The new HOA board was functional and reasonable. They focused on maintaining the common areas, organizing community events, and handling legitimate disputes between neighbors. They didn't try to control what color people painted their shutters or fine them for having their garbage cans out too long. It was what an HOA should be: a helpful organizational structure for a community, not a tyrannical mini-government. About a year after everything started, I was interviewed for a documentary about HOA reform. The filmmaker had reached out through Margaret Chen, and after some consideration, I agreed to participate. The documentary, titled Gated Tyranny, The Fight for HOA Accountability premiered at a film festival in Portland and was later picked up by a streaming service. My segment was only about 15 minutes of the 90-minute film, but it effectively illustrated the dangers of unchecked HOA power. The documentary also featured interviews with legislators, attorneys, and other homeowners who had fought against abusive HOAs. It won an award for Best Documentary Feature at the festival. I attended the premiere, which was strange. Seeing myself on a big screen talking about emergency supplies and property boundaries felt deeply weird. But the message of the documentary was important, and I was glad to be part of it. The filmmaker, a woman named Sarah Chen who coincidentally shared a last name with my lawyer, told me afterward that the documentary had already led to reform discussions in 3 other states. "Your story resonated with people because it's so clear-cut," she said. "You didn't do anything wrong. You weren't part of their HOA. They had no right to do what they did. It's that simplicity that makes it powerful." 2 years after the initial confrontation, I was living a completely normal life. The whole Patricia Caldwell situation had become a story I occasionally told at parties when the conversation turned to crazy neighbor experiences. My house had appreciated in value, partly because Willow Creek Estates had become known as a well-managed community with a reasonable HOA after the reforms. I had also become something of an unexpected advocate for HOA reform. I served on an advisory board for the State Oversight Committee that had been established by HB 2847. We reviewed complaints, investigated abuses, and made recommendations for additional reforms. It was volunteer work, but it felt meaningful. One of the complaints we reviewed came from a family in Bend, whose HOA was trying to force them to remove solar panels from their roof, because they supposedly violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. We ruled in favor of the family, citing the new protections in HB 2847, and the HOA was forced to back down. The family sent me a thank you card with a photo of their solar panels, which I kept on my refrigerator. Margaret Chen told me I should write a book about my experience. "People need to know how to protect themselves," she said, "and you've become an expert almost by accident." I thought about it but ultimately decided against it. I'd shared my story enough. Now I just wanted to live my life. But I did start a blog, anonymously at first, where I shared advice for people dealing with difficult HOAs. I explained how to document violations, when to hire a lawyer, and how to know if your HOA was overstepping its legal authority. The blog grew slowly but steadily, and I eventually revealed my identity after a reader figured out who I was based on the details of my case. The blog became a resource that lawyers and homeowner advocates would reference. I interviewed other people who had fought against abusive HOAs and won. I broke down the new legislation in Oregon and other states in plain language so regular people could understand their rights. It became a hobby that I genuinely enjoyed, turning my frustrating experience into something helpful for others. I also upgraded my emergency preparedness even further. I took a wilderness first aid course and got certified as an emergency responder. I joined a local community emergency response team and learned skills like fire suppression, light search and rescue, and disaster psychology. If a major earthquake or other disaster ever hit, I wanted to be able to help my community, not because some HOA demanded it, but because it was the right thing to do. Ironically, several of my neighbors in Willow Creek Estates asked me for advice on building their own emergency kits after seeing mine. I was happy to help, sharing recommendations on what supplies to stock, how to store water long-term, and what kind of equipment was worth the investment. A few families went in together to buy a community generator, which they stored in the HOA's maintenance shed for emergency use. The new HOA president, a level-headed man named Marcus Thompson who worked as an engineer, told me, "You know, Patricia had the right idea about emergency preparedness being important. She just went about it in literally the worst possible way. Instead of stealing from you, she should have used you as a resource to help educate the community." "That would have required her to see me as a person instead of a target," I said. "True," Marcus agreed, "but we're learning from her mistakes. That's something." 3 years after everything began, I attended Patricia Caldwell's parole hearing as an observer. She had served 3 years of her 14-year sentence and was making her first bid for early release. I didn't plan to speak, just to be present. Patricia looked older and worn down in her prison jumpsuit. Her aggressive blonde bob was gone, replaced by gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her lawyer made the case that she had been a model prisoner, had completed educational programs, and was remorseful for her actions. When the parole board asked Patricia if she wanted to say anything, she stood and read from a prepared statement. Her voice was much quieter than I remembered. "I know I hurt a lot of people with my actions," she said. "I convinced myself that I was helping my community, but really I was just feeding my own need for control and financial gain. I stole from people who had done nothing wrong. I violated their rights and their trust. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I just want to acknowledge the harm I caused and say that I'm sorry." She looked directly at me when she said that last part. I kept my face neutral. The parole board denied her request for early release, citing the severity of her crimes and her history of similar conduct in other states. She would be eligible to apply again in 2 years. As I left the hearing, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Patricia had destroyed her own life through her actions, and while she deserved the consequences, it was still tragic in its way. She could have just been a normal HOA president, focused on legitimate community issues, and none of this would have happened. But she had made her choices, and I had made mine. I chose to stand up for my rights. I chose to hold her accountable. I chose to use the experience to help others. Those were the right choices, even though they had been difficult at the time. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much my life had changed because of one bizarre confrontation over emergency supplies. I had become an advocate, a writer, a public figure in a small way, and an expert on HOA law despite having no legal training. I had made new friends, helped pass new laws, and contributed to a movement that was making real changes in how HOAs operated across the country. But most importantly, I had protected my home and my rights. That was what mattered most. I had drawn a line and defended it, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against an abusive HOA. When I pulled into my driveway that night, I sat in my car for a moment, looking at my house. It was just a simple ranch-style home in a quiet suburb, nothing fancy or special. But it was mine, completely and totally mine, and nobody had the right to take that away from me. I got out of the car and walked to the garage, punching in the code to open the door. Inside, my emergency supplies were neatly organized on their shelves, exactly where they should be. Water, food, medical equipment, tools, everything I might need if disaster struck. My property on my land, under my control. That was all I had ever wanted. The fact that defending that simple principle had led to arrests, trials, legislation, and documentaries was almost absurd. But it proved that sometimes standing up for what's right, even in a small way, can have ripples far beyond what you ever imagined. I closed the garage door and went inside my house, ready for whatever came next, knowing that I had the supplies, the knowledge, and the legal protections to face it on my own terms. Patricia Caldwell had tried to take that from me and failed. The HOA had tried to control me and failed. I was still here, still free, still prepared for anything. And that was exactly how it should be.